Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, part 4 of our SAP Cloud Security Madness series. Today's presenter is going to be Carsten Old from our German office, and he will be talking about SAP Cloud Identity Services, or IaaS. And I'm not sure if you've seen the email that was sent out yesterday, but it turned out that Carsten got so much content, so much important content that he thought would be educational, valuable for you guys, that will run a little bit longer than anticipated. In fact, we're going to be running about 45 minutes longer. But don't worry, if you can stick with us until the very end, obviously there is going to be a recording as with the previous webinars as well. So you can just continue watching or watch at the end if you can't stick with us. Before we get started, though, before I'm going to hand over to Carsten, just a few housekeeping questions in case this is your first time joining us today. Again, this webinar will be recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. In the past, I always said you will receive one from GoToWebinar directly within 24 hours, but it turned out we misconfigured the series and you'll only get a link to the recordings, it looks like, at the end of the series. So we'll be sending out ad hoc emails, basically, like we did last week with the links to the recordings of the previous webinars. So stay tuned for that. Also, if you have any questions, we will be taking questions at the end today. Since we have a lot of content to cover, we'll do a Q&A at the end. So use your questions box or control panel, or the questions section there in the GoToWebinar control panel. You might have to expand it if it's hidden, but if you click on the little arrow next to the questions title, then a drop down will appear and you can see where there is a text box where it says type answer here. Just type us your questions and I'll be reading them out loud at the end of the session, and Carsten will be answering them. And I think that is pretty much it. So again, this is number 4 of 7. So we'll show, I think, Carsten at the end, maybe a quick overview where we stand and what's next, so you get an idea of what the upcoming topics are going to be. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Carsten, and he's going to walk you through today's webinar about Cloud Identity Services.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So you can see my screen, everything well? Okay. Yep. Perfect. So then, welcome everyone to that part 4 of our webinar series, Cloud Madness. I'm Carsten, and I will guide you today to this webinar. And we talk about a component today, generally known as the Identity Authentication Service, or SAP IaaS. And as Michael said, during the preparation of that webinar, we have seen there's a lot of stuff we need to talk about. And it is also super important to really understand the underlying technologies like SAML, some background information about the business technology platform, the authentication, and also the authorization framework related to that. And so I decided to provide educational content, lots of basics, and also live demonstrations today in a storytelling way that I have bundled into that webinar. And so that will take around 45 minutes longer than initially planned, but that's okay. As Michael said, you are welcome to stay till the very end, or you can just watch the recording when it fits best for you. Okay, that being said, I don't have to hurry here anymore, and we can just start with our webinar. All right, as always, it makes sense to start with some basics, understanding the typical challenges that all customers have to deal with in the area of user authentication, also to understand a single sign-on in general, the SAML Flow, the concept of federated identities. That's more or less the foundation that you need to really work with the Identity Authentication Service. In this context, you will also learn how authentication, but also authorization mixes up in the cloud world. And in the live demos, we also talk about how SAP implements OAuth 2 in the business technology platform. And so not only the authentication, but also especially the user authorizations for applications running in the Neo or the Cloud Foundry environments, they can be assigned in an automated way. And we will talk about that as well. And also, we take a look at the authentication decision tree, telling you or providing you some information about a platform and the software as a service applications, so you then understand better when you can use a corporate IDP and when you have to use the identity authentication service in a mandatory way. And furthermore, we talk about the most important features. There are lots of things you can do with the identity authentication service, many features, many use cases. And just instead of showing boring SAP marketing slides, we decided to rather focus on real integration scenarios, like with existing identity providers, like Azure AD nowadays, very important, and also to how to handle user management, group management, and also the claims management and that stuff. So I think it will be an interesting mix of theory and practice. And the demos we have prepared are really showing commonly used integration scenarios that are used by our SAP customers. So let's hope everything will work today, because it's live. We're not pre-record here anything. All right, so next one. Shortly about the speakers, together with my colleagues Alessandro Banza, which is our GRC expert. He gave an overview about the identity access governance last week, and also Steffen, who is our expert for IDM. He talked about the Cloud Identity Provisioning Service, or IPS, 2 weeks ago. And together we make up the Cloud Madness team. So I'm Carsten, the one in the middle, and I'm an SAP security consultant and trainer working for Exciting in the German subsidiary. So single sign-on is my main topic, I would say, together with secure authentication and also cloud security in general. So I support mainly organizations to translate between IT security and SAP security, and here with a strong focus to SSO. That also includes, integration in Active Directory, PKI topics, multi-factor authentication, also digital signatures, encryption of communication paths like SNC, like transport layer security, that stuff and the solutions around that. So you know me now, you know how I look, and I'd like to say thank you for being here. I will now switch off the camera so we can jump over to the webinar roadmap and then start shortly with the real content. So first of all, I don't know if you have or joined today for the first time. You should know we already finished the first three webinars. In case you missed one, as Michael said, you can easily access the existing recordings. I think we will send out another email, maybe with the links to those recordings to all registered users. And now, since in part 4, I will continue the deep dive into the cloud security solutions. This time, we just talk about the identity authentication service. And now in part 5 and 6, next week, Alessandro will again talk about the GRC bridge scenario, where you really integrate the identity access governance with your existing access control and also the HR-driven ID lifecycle. And then finally, number 7, Steffen will complement the big picture by explaining how a hybrid identity management can be established in a secure and compliant way. As you see, a lot of interesting stuff is waiting, so you can stay tuned here in our Cloud Madness. So the component we are talking about today, again, it is part of the Cloud Identity Services. And that one consists out of the Identity Authentication Service, the one we talk here, basically a SAML identity provider with a central user store, and the Identity Provisioning Service, or IPS, that is responsible for all the user and group provisioning. So that's the one you already learned about in part 2. And you should know that currently both are in the process of transformation. So SAP is heavily working on that to really convert everything into a one-stop shop, providing a holistic approach to identity and access management for all SAP Cloud applications. So currently, both components seem to operate independently, but that will change in the next couple of months, I'm sure. All right, so let's start here. When I first saw identity authentication service, it was around at the end of 2016. I was very confused. At that time, I already had connected a lot of applications, either on-premise or cloud applications, to an existing IDP like ADFS, Federation Services. That was the time for ADFS before the big Azure hype, but also others like Shibboleth, OpenAM, BigIP, and so on. So when it comes to SAML, to establish trust, to exchange metadata, and so on, I was really confused why SAP has come up with an own identity provider and why applications are not just integrated with an existing IDP like before. And well, some of them still do, but for others, the identity authentication is already mandatory. So the identity authentication will be the gold standard soon, and there is no way around this component. And that's really why we're talking about it here in this webinar. And if you learn one thing from this webinar, then hopefully why the identity authentication service makes sense as a central hub and what benefit it really brings over the traditional and outdated approach that we see here, where a customer directly connect the cloud applications or even on-premise applications to an existing IDP. So we will really dive deeper into that and talk about the different scenarios that really make sense in that space. First of all, a little information about the identity authentication in general. So the IAS is meant to be a central system that connects with all cloud applications available in the SAP universe. It provides access for all devices and user types. That means employees, but also business partners for B2B and B2C scenarios. So it's a multi-tenancy cloud application. It runs in the cloud only and is at the end, it's an identity provider for all applications from the SAP Business Technology Platform and the whole software as a service tools provided by SAP. And there we can have, of course, which is a SAML identity provider and also an OpenID identity provider. It also allows integration with all cloud applications. It provides you with a secure and simple access, meaning it also enables single sign-on scenarios. It comes up with enterprise features, meaning you can integrate with existing authentication systems that you may already have or also existing user stores. That's at the end one of the core functionalities of this system. And of course, you can have risk-based rules. You can use multi-factor authentication. You really can secure the initial access to your cloud applications, and everything is tunneled through this central component. But before really we dive deeper into that component, we start with some basics first. And first of all, when it comes to authentication, the target is always to design a holistic solution concept that takes really all implications into account. So you look at the requirements typically for secure authentication and for single sign-on in such hybrid landscapes. You should try to cover as many of your applications as possible. And if you look at the typical requirements, it's often to implement, in the best case, an automated approach, how you manage your users and your groups in your applications. That's, for example, the identity management topic. Then you like to centralize the authentication. So you like to enable the secure authentication and the single sign-on for all users, meaning you centrally bundle and regulate access on a central point. That's why you need to have a central policy enforcement point, which is the identity authentication service. Also, you can implement risk-based multi-factor authentication. So since a while now, and also this is I noticed this in my project, that SAP organizations have really increased security challenges when it comes to cloud. So for example, they have security requirements that, for example, they need a device integrity checking or better multi-factor solutions and even policies like Azure conditional access. For example, to restrict application access only for company managed devices. Those are valid requirements that are more and more asked by our customers. In addition to that, it's very important that users have really the same authentication experience when it comes to on-premise and cloud applications. That's really important that you have, let's say, the same point, the same look and feel for your authentication. And together with the GRC and the identity management topics, I don't talk about that here in much detail, but together with those two solutions, you really have let's say, an automated management of all users, groups, and role assignments. It's really then a foundation for a holistic user lifecycle and role management approach. That's more or less a summary of the most important challenges that you have to face when it comes to authentication in a hybrid landscape. As I said, this is the overview. Today we purely focus on the topic of authentication and mainly also on the solution that is made for the cloud, the Cloud Identity Services, that is more or less working together closely with the product that is already known maybe by you, the SAP Single Sign-On solution. I don't want to talk about this slide in more detail. It's just for your reference. There is a solution available that is the on-premise solution to the Single Sign-On 3. The on-premise solution is well known. You still need the solution for your, let's say, desktop clients, for your SAP logon to enable SNC and that stuff. And in addition to that, now the cloud solution, the identity authentication service that provides really a solution for browser-based access to your cloud applications. And at the end, it's a combination of both solutions. So they both are important, and you can both use them for really a hybrid landscape. Before we start, we should first talk a little bit about single sign-on in general and what the concept behind single sign-on really is. And I do it really shortly here. So first of all, the idea of single sign-on is that you no longer authenticate against each application, but instead you perform a so-called primary authentication. And the result of a successfully primary authentication against a central system is that you receive a security token or a single sign-on token. And that token actually contains a key, and that key at the end allows you to access your applications in an automated way. So you have a single sign-on now. And there may be applications that are not allowed to use single sign-on, and they can, on top of that, enforce a risk-based or a multi-factor based authentication anytime. So you can also integrate with third-party solutions, for example, to have more security components like checking for company device and all that stuff. That's more or less behind single sign-on. The idea is to outsource authentication to an external system. You receive a security token instead of credentials. That means you also can get rid of passwords that are stored in your SAP systems or in the cloud systems at least. So password hashes are no longer available. You can also force the login with a security token or multi-factor authentication. At the end, the authentication will be done by checking the identity that is contained in the security token. So the application more or less has to implement a so-called user mapping mechanism. And that is it, more or less. And you have to authorize, of course, your users. That is still unchanged, still based on role-based access control. But you will notice this shortly, that this will change in the cloud world, because here we can also provide authorizations together with the authentication. So more or less, we have solved our issues, our problems that we have, our challenges for the authentication on the on-premise world. That's okay, we can use a single sign-on product. And now we have to think about what could be the best approach for a single sign-on towards all our SAP cloud applications, meaning software as a service applications and the platform as a service offering, the business technology platform with the different environments where you can also run your own applications or just consume existing applications. So that is more or less important to understand. Now we use a technology that's called SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language. I know it sounds pretty boring, but it is by far the most flexible and adopted single sign-on technology out there. So it's basically an XML-based authentication framework that is specified for browser-based access. So SAML is seen as a default mechanism in the cloud. And in this context, we use it for authentication. So the IDP, that is later on our identity authentication service, is responsible for that, for the authentication. We use it for user identification in the target application, and also, and that's now in addition to that, for providing the authorizations based on claims that we can provide to applications. We take a closer look to that. So the first step, a user wants to access a service in the cloud or maybe on-premise, it's also possible. And it is essential to understand now that SAML-enabled web applications delegate, or you can say outsource, the user authentication to a central instance. The identity provider now proves that a subject, the user itself, has identified successfully. So users have to authenticate there by different means, maybe single sign-on, so it's completely transparent, and maybe it is just a password or a second factor of authentication. So many cloud applications have no local user database. That's important to understand. They don't even persist user accounts. Instead, they totally rely on the SAML token that they will get as a proof of identity. So the business technology platform, for example, uses exactly that concept, and it outsources all identities to let's say to an external system that is the identity provider. So it supports identity federation, more or less. There's no need to obtain and store user credentials to authenticate them. Instead, a user base from a connected identity provider will be used. So finally, with the business technology platform, there's the concept of the platform IDP and the application IDP. By default, the sub-ID service, you may notice, is used as a platform IDP. So the one that is required for all platform users accessing the cockpit and the command line interface. So those normally are the administrators. And customers also can switch to a preferred application IDP at any time. So for example, it can be the identity authentication service. Now let's have a closer look at the SAML flow. Here, first of all, the IDP and the service provider, they need to establish a mutual trust relationship. That means the exchange of the so-called SAML metadata on both sides. And that contains entity IDs, protocol, endpoint, URLs, locations, cryptographic keys, all that stuff. And this is often a very complex and a very error-prone process. So one of the reasons why SAP has automated this integration with the identity authentication service. And that's one of their targets. So to deliver a cloud application with a pre-configured trust to your identity authentication tenant. Okay, so let's proceed in the flow. First of all, user tries to access a protected application, for example, the Fiori portal or the identity access governance that runs in the cloud. So the cloud application now creates and also signs a so-called SAML authentication request that is then redirected to the configured trusted IDP via the user's browser. So if not already done, the user now has to authenticate at the identity provider. And that actually is the real authentication process that happens, which involves a user interaction, like an MFA, for example. But it can be also, as I said, fully transparent. That is when you use single sign-on against the identity provider. So a successful authentication in step 4 triggers the creation of a SAML assertion or a so-called SAML response. And that is issued by the identity provider, and that certifies a user's identity against the target application. So that is now the service provider. And at the end, as you see, request and response, everything is transferred between the IDP and the service provider, usually through the client browser in the middle. So now, what is a SAML assertion? You can see it as a proof of identity. It contains one or more, let's say, statements about the identity, can be the so-called subject, and it contains so-called assertion attributes. And of course, a SAML token, so actually the XML is digitally signed, and depending on your security requirements, it can be encrypted as well. So each assertion must be checked, must be verified by the service provider, and that really guarantees integrity and also authenticity. And then after a successful verification, the service provider really parses the content and really decides about the authentication and the authorization of a user. So the SAML technology enables a user to be identified using different attributes, like we can see here. Could be first name, last name, could be email address, could be a logon name. That is normally used for the authentication. And also, the SAML standard is used to provide additional information about, let's say, attributes about the user, like a cost center, a company, department, and so on. And those attributes can be evaluated by the target application. And very important about that are the group memberships. Typically, group memberships are provided as part of the assertion from the IDP to the application. And that enables a service provider to assign a user to specific authorization roles dynamically. That happens really during logon time. And that is why, let's say, the IDP component, and especially the identity authentication service, that can be seen as a central authentication hub for all SAML-enabled SAP applications. That really helps you to bundle and to also control authorization information provided to your applications. So a summary about identity federation, a very short one. Authentication is always delegated to the identity provider. There is no need to really persist users. So depending on the application, it may have a database, others do not have one. So there are no longer passwords and credentials. Everything is centrally managed on the identity provider. Users can still benefit on single sign-on towards the IDP, and administrators really have the advantage that they have a central user location, the IDP, where they can just manage users and groups, and they're completely decoupled from the application side. So users can be dynamically authorized, as I said, based on these SAML claim information that we provide. And the most important standards for that is really, besides SAML 2, it is really OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SCIM. Now we talk about a little bit more about the OAuth standard as well in this webinar. All right. So first of all, let's start with a short feature overview. And I would like to start here where we should talk about where or how does the identity authentication service will be provided to a customer. So first of all, the identity services, the cloud identity services, also including the IPS, the identity provisioning service, nowadays is included for all SAP branded cloud solutions that are sold under the general terms and conditions. That means all applications running on the business technology platform runtime. So each SAP cloud customer is entitled for one productive and one non-productive tenant of that solution. Of course, a partner or a customer can also request more tenants using the Cloud Platform Enterprise Agreement as a self-service. So you can have several identity authentication tenants for different use cases, for example. So IAS no longer has an extra position on the SAP price list. Instead, it comes out of the box together with a lot of cloud applications. One that you can see here, or some you can see here on the screen, but more or less the list is growing every day. And also important to understand is that when you integrate this solution with with an existing corporate user store or with an existing identity provider, there's no extra license required for that. It's just when you integrate any on-premise application or any non-SAP application to your identity service tenant, then you have to pay for the logon request per user per day. That's a separate position. We don't talk about this in more detail. That's something that you can obtain from SAP, from your account executive at SAP. So let's start with that picture showing more or less the complete overview about the authentication service. First of all, as I said, we have a lot of cloud applications in the SAP universe. They come, in the best case, pre-configured and pre-connected to your identity authentication tenant. And you have your users on the left side that like to reach the cloud applications. So now you have to think about how you really handle your users. So you can create user accounts in your identity authentication service, and you can authorize users and authenticate them based on credentials or existing X509 certificates that you may use. You can also use multi-factor authentication and other means of a second factor. And you can forward the authentication to a corporate or a social IDP. That's more or less the basic functionality. The more important one is indeed the identity federation functionality that allows you to seamlessly integrate the identity authentication service with an existing corporate IDP. That can be ADFS or Azure AD or any SAML compliant IDP, meaning you don't have to take care about your users and credentials. They are already existing in your existing corporate IDP. You just connect your tenant to that corporate IDP as a proxy. Another scenario is when you have your users already in Active Directory or a connected SAP HCM or whatever. So you can just connect in addition to a so-called corporate user store. That's technically done by using a SCIM protocol, and that allows you some additional features, like you can enable a so-called Kerberos SPNego single sign-on on your IaaS tenant. And lastly, you can also connect non-SAP applications to that system. That's more or less the big picture about that. And we nearly talk about all these different scenarios in that webinar. So stay tuned for the live demo. All right, so next, the question is always how really the identities can be created or should be created in the identity authentication service. Of course, there are multiple or many ways that you can use. So you can easily use the administration console and create the users by hand manually. You can also automate the user creation using the SCIM endpoints that is provided by the identity authentication service. Or, as I said, you can just integrate with existing systems. But it's mainly the question why you should create the identity there. And the answer for that is, and we will see this later on as well, that SAP really sees the identity authentication user store as a central one that is so more or less the basis for all cloud application. And once you create a user in the identity authentication service, it will be enriched with at least two very important attributes. One is the P user or the user ID, I would say, so-called P user, and the other is the universal unique identifier UUID. And both are really important, and they're getting more and more important in the cloud space. Short excursus to the Cloud Identity Services identity provisioning. We already seen this more or less. So the identity provisioning service is at the end another component part of the identity service that is connected often to a, let's say, existing source system. You have your Active Directory or your Azure, or maybe you have your identity management system, and you can easily read user information, and you write this user information, also group information, to your central user store on the identity authentication service. So now this is used as a source for provisioning of users towards cloud applications, meaning you can now keep track of the identity lifecycle using your IPS and using the SCIM interface of your cloud applications. And on top of that, the identity authentication service takes care of all the authentication and also the authorization stuff for your on-premise and for your cloud applications. You also can connect, as I said, your identity authentication easily to an existing corporate IDP. So the idea of SAP is really to connect an source system, mostly it's the Azure Active Directory nowadays, to read the information and to really write this information to provide all the required user accounts into your identity authentication user store. Once you got your users in there, you can use the source system, the identity authentication user store, as a source system, and then based on that, you can provide and provision users to all applications in the cloud space. But it's more or less like a central user administration in the cloud. Of course, there are many different other ways that you can do. You can directly provision users from Azure to your cloud applications. You can use your identity management. At the end, it's all based on the system for cross-domain identity management, short SCIM, that helps you to really automate user creation, group management, and all that stuff. If we take a look at the really important core features of identity authentication, then, of course, as I said, we have a lot of different standardized authentication methods that you can make use of, like certificates, Kerberos, one-time passwords, also normal login credentials and all that stuff. You can easily delegate the authentication towards existing user stores, corporate IDPs. There are authentication options, flexible password policies. You can really almost manage everything and also customize everything. You have invitation workflows. You can make use of self-service user registration. You can customize the registration forms behind. You can have a risk-based framework that really works on different rules and really checks for different conditions in order to make sure a user is really compliant for your application. You can support the connection with existing IDM systems via the SCIM endpoint that the identity authentication service offers. And you really can customize the whole thing, meaning a company branding. You can use authentication overlays. So at the end, the authentication experience looks like it is a system from your organization. That's more or less a short summary about the core features. And as I said, we will really learn more in the demonstration part. Before we move over to the live demos, let's have a look at the authentication decision tree. And that is when a corporate IDP can be used and when the identity authentication service must be used. And we will first start at the business technology platform. As I said before, here we have the platform IDP and the application IDP. So the pre-configured identity provider for the platform is always the sub-ID service. That is the one that is managed by SAP. So you can easily start with your existing S user and you have your platform users. They can authenticate using either the sub-ID service or the identity authentication service. And this must be the identity authentication service. It means you cannot no longer connect your existing IDP directly to the platform. And the identity authentication service, in turn, it can be configured to either use local users that you persist in the IAS, or you can just use your corporate user store and just forward to your corporate IDP. So in turn, even though you can't connect your corporate IDP directly to the business technology platform, you can just do it via the proxy functionality. So at the end, you can manage your users and groups still in your corporate IDP and control access to your sub-cloud platform for the platform users. From a business user perspective, if you take a look at the application IDP, that is more or less the most important one when it comes to your applications that you deploy and run on the cloud. You can easily connect any third-party IDP to that. So that's still possible, but you can also use the identity authentication service in the same way. Still corporate user store, or just forward delegate your authentication to your existing corporate IDP. That is more or less the thing that's important to understand when it comes to the business technology platform, to the handling of the IDPs that you can make use of in your cloud platform or business technology platform SAP accounts. If we take a look at the software as a service applications, at least currently, it really depends on which SAP Cloud application you use. So, for example, on the left side, we can see an application like SAP Analytics Cloud. It can be also Ariba or other applications that are not really fully integrated in a way that others are, like, for example, on the right side, the integrated business planning, or can be the S/4HANA public cloud. Those are solutions that really both can make use of the SAP ID service very, very easily. So they are pre-delivered mostly with that. So you can quick start and assign some S users, and you can directly make use of the application. But you can also connect your identity provider. And for example, for the integrated business planning, the IAS is already mandatory. And also for other applications. So it means you can still, of course, do the same thing. You can connect via the identity authentication service your corporate IDP in a proxy scenario. At the end, it is fully transparent to the end user. However, on applications that are not yet integrated that way, you still be able to directly connect, for example, your SAP Analytics Cloud tenant to any corporate IDP that you may have, or any third-party IDP, but also the identity authentication service again. That's a little bit confusing, maybe for the first time you hear this, but as I said, it's important to understand really the features and the options that you really have to connect your authentication systems. And the recommendation of SAP is, of course, to make use of the identity authentication service always as a central component, and then connect your corporate IDP to your identity authentication tenant. All right, so let's start with the first demo. I've prepared 5 scenarios, and I would like to walk through these 5 scenarios together with you. First of all, let's take a look at the first one. The first one, we will use the SAP Web IDE full stack as one cloud target application. And this time, the Web IDE is running on a Business Technology Neo SAP account. So here we use just a normal identity authentication tenant as the identity provider, and I'd like to show you how you manually really create a user and you really perform the login process. And later on, we will jump over to the single sign-on, where we connect to a social IDP. We will use Google for that. First, I would like to show you one additional slide that we can see the scenario now. So we have a user, we have the Web IDE as a cloud application, and we have our SAP Identity Authentication Service tenant. So in the best case, the business technology platform is connected to the IAS, so it trusts and uses the IAS as a primary identity provider. The user authentication is delegated to the IAS, and after a successful authentication, the user receives a SAML token, and that token is used for single sign-on to the application. So now you have to make sure and think about how you really handle your users and groups and how you create them in your identity authentication tenant, and also how you implement a single sign-on for that user. All right, so let's jump over to the demo. For that, I like to really start with the admin point of view. So I like to fire up a Safari here, and first I connect to the business technology platform, or let's say the identity authentication admin console first. Let me just log in here with my Google account. That's more or less the admin side. And from the end user point of view, we have prepared a Windows client with a Google Chrome browser. And from there, we can try to access our Web IDE full stack application. And once we do that, you can see that we are redirected to the login page of the configured identity authentication service tenant that welcomes us, and yeah, the user has to authenticate. All right, so now, first of all, what we need to have is we need to have a user in our identity authentication service. Let's go to the user management, and here you see that we don't have much users. So in the first step, I will create a user manually together with you. So just provide a first name, last name, and also an email address. Let's use this one. Let's also provide a login name like Cloud Madness, and also an employee type. In this case, just select an employee. So the password of that user I would like to send via email, so I can really perform or set the password using a self-service. So just create that user, and in a while I should also receive an email from the identity authentication service, from the cloud service, that I can activate the account. Here I will just copy over that link, and I open the activation email or the activation link on the end user client. Paste it over, and now I can really activate the account, set the password. So I have the first account created in the identity authentication service. That's it. It shows my profile. I will now one more time close the browser, and now open it up again. And I try to connect to the Web IDE full stack this time. And now, as I have a user, I can use my username, the Cloud Madness user. Again, let's check if this user is really created. You can see this is the username. And we also see that the identity authentication really enriched this user information with that user ID, with a P user number, and with the user unique ID. These two you can't change. They are just created dynamically by the identity authentication service. So that user also has a password set. Has no user groups assigned yet, and there are really no other settings available, but it's just a normal local user in the user store of the IAS. So go back here, select continue, and now we enter the password of that user. And let's see what happens. Well, obviously we are successfully authenticated against the system, but it says that we have not authorized to access the Web IDE from this account. So first of all, let's take a look at the SAML Flow. So actually you can see that I have in the tracer, I have one request. That is the one that comes from the business technology platform and is sent to the identity authentication tenant. And then I got the response that I have received really from the issuer, from the identity authentication service. This is the token, the actual token that is sent over via the browser to the business technology platform. And here you can also see the user ID, the P number 180, and also some additional information like first name, last name, email address, user unique ID. So obviously we don't have the right permission to access the Web IDE. For that, let me just try to assign a group. Let me just switch over. We go to user groups, and we can just assign another group to that user, and that group is called Web IDE Access. Save. Now user is assigned to that group, and we can try again to connect to our application. It always makes sense to close the browser when you work with SAML, and then again connect, enter the password, and we should be successfully authenticated, hopefully, and also authorized now to access the Web IDE. So it takes a while, but then you can see, what's that? Try out, no, show me later. You can see this is our P user. We are successfully authenticated and authorized, and our SAML response has been enriched at least with one additional group membership. It's hard to see here. You can see Web IDE access is provided in the groups claim with that attribute name. Just one group information that we now have provided in our SAML assertion. So in order to really understand what's happening behind the scenes with that group assignment, we now open another tab and we connect to the business technology platform cockpit. And that cockpit now is directly connected to our sub account where the Web IDE service is running. And here, typically we configure in the trust section, we configure our trusted application identity provider. And that is exactly our IaaS tenant that we use here. And if we click on that system and on the groups tab, we can see there are some assertion-based group mappings. That's more or less a rule-based mapping. This is the group that has been created in the cloud, and it has to match the group's claim equals to a specific value. In this case, it's exactly this rule that will really grant us access to that. However, for that, we need first to have a group. And with that, you can take a look at the authorizations and the groups. And here we can see that there is a group existing. It's called Web IDE Access. And they also can see that this group is really mapped using an identity provider, and that several rules apply to that group mapping. So you cannot just have one, but many assertion attributes mapped to that group. And lastly, we got the service that we like to connect to. In this case, the service is somehow here. Let's check. Here's the Web IDE full stack. And if we go to that service and configure that service, at the end, we have 3 roles, just like the predefined ones, like the DI developer role. And that one is really, it's possible to really allow the access to the resource. You can assign groups or even individual users to that role. Yeah, you can see here is the Web IDE access group is assigned to that role, meaning every user part of that group is automatically part of that role. And during the evaluation of the access decision to specific services, the SAML group assignment and also the mapping of the SAML groups to roles is combined and is evaluated. And that automated group mapping is considered as the so-called federated role assignment. That's just one excursus to the business technology platform Neo environment. Okay, now let's enable another functionality that's called social sign-on. So for that application, this is done on the application level. So first of all, we need to go to applications. And here we can see all our service providers that we have set up in the identity authentication. And the one of this is the Neo sub account. And here we can move over to the authentication and access tab and just switch on social sign-on. That more or less will enrich our, let's say, login screen. For that, we have, of course, connected and before we have configured some social IDPs. You can make use of Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and also it's relatively new, Apple. So you need mainly a developer account. You exchange some OAuth credentials, and that's it. It's easy to configure. So we have enabled that. Let's go over. Let's close the browser one more time, and let's open again our connection to the Web IDE full stack. And now you can see that we not only can authenticate with a local user, but also we can use a social IDP. And this time I connect or I select Google. Now Google, of course, because I do it for the first time here, asked me to enter a Google user. I will do this now. And of course, the corresponding password to that Google user. And now you can see that I have to link my account. So I have to enter my password from the identity authentication user one last time and select link accounts. That's it. It says, okay, now my account is linked. I continue. And obviously I'm authenticated the same way I was authenticated before. So I'm still the same user, P180. Let me just close the browser again and show you how this behaves in the next login. Again, start the application, and now we just have to select our Google account, and now we just signed in automatically to our cloud application. That's more or less the typical scenario that is used for business to business or business to consumer scenarios, where you have some external accounts that want to have an easy way to authorize or authenticate against your system. All right, that's one scenario that I like to show to you. Next one is about, here we use a different kind of service provider. We no longer use the Web IDE. Instead, we just use a demo service provider that just shows the SAML claims on the websites, just to demonstrate the SAML flow in a better way. And for that, especially, I like to show you the risk-based authentication and how this really works. So first of all, let's switch over to the end user computer and let's try to open our application. This time we use another one. Here again, he asks us for the username. You can see there is no social sign-on enabled for that application. So I will have to log in with the username and with the password. And you can see, sorry, you are not authorized. So obviously something is wrong. Let's check this. Let's go to the application and to the demo showcase application. And here in the authentication or authentication access tab, we can configure the so-called risk-based authentication, where you can set a default action, either allow or deny. This time it's set to deny. However, there is a rule that only users assigned to the Cloud Madness group are allowed to access. So let us just, before we add our user to that group, let's modify this rule a little bit. And we not only want to allow the access, instead we want to enforce a second factor of authentication. So select two-factor authentication here. And as a method, we can either select time-based one-time password, that is the SAP standard, or web authentication, that is more or less FIDO2 support, that you can use hardware tokens or even the fingerprint sensor of your MacBook, whatever. That's cool stuff. It's supported already here. And this time, I just select the time-based one-time password solution. And of course, the group. Okay, updated the rule. I saved the rule. And lastly, I need to assign our user to this group. So let's go to the user and let's assign this user to the Cloud Madness group. Should be here. There is it, and save. Now we have two groups assigned to that user, and yeah, let's move over to the end user screen and let's see what happens in this case. Connect to the application. Again, username and password. And now I would expect that something else is happening, you can see now it says, okay, your user needs to provide a two-factor authentication. That means I first need to scan that QR code with an authenticator app. And that can be any compatible authenticator app. So in this case, I try to just show this to you. Hopefully it works. Sometimes it doesn't work. To mirror the phone screen here to that system. Well, I'm lucky. Today it works. So let's move this over. And here on my phone, I have just installed the SAP Authenticator. You just like to add a new account to that authenticator. Let's select scan the QR code, and then I just scan the QR code that is shown on display, and that's it. Now my account is set up, and I have to enter one, or let's say the first code that is generated here in order to verify my account. That's it. That works. And now I have to accept some disclaimers that the organization has configured for that application. That's also done in the IAS. You can customize any application disclaimers and then select accept. And now I'm obviously located and authenticated again. This time you can see the user information in that application that just shows our SAML attribute information, like a company name, like the email address, and also you can see the two groups that this user is assigned to. That's just a nice application to show up the SAML information, more or less. All right, that is more or less the second scenario. And now let's come to the interesting stuff. So the other two was the boring scenarios. Now let's come to the interesting ones where we really connect the identity authentication to a corporate IDP. So we like to delegate the authentication towards Azure. And also we will programmatically create a user account using SCIM, so no longer create them manually. We'll do this both with identity federation disabled, the first step, and also enabled in the second step. And I will also explain what that means in more detail. All right, before we start, I'd like to show you some theory about that scenario as well. Again, we have our cloud application and we have the identity authentication service. And now you can imagine that most organizations out there already have a corporate identity provider like an Azure or ADFS. And they have also already connected lots of non-SAP software as a service applications. And the idea about the integration is that you now connect both the IAS and the Azure using just a SAML trust. So it's just one additional enterprise application in the Azure. And you just delegate all authentication requests to your Azure instance as a proxy. That means that you still are able to reuse your existing processes for user and group management. Yeah, because your user already exists in the corporate IDP. You don't have to take care about creating users in the identity authentication store. Also, you can reuse your existing single sign-on solution, security policies like conditional access, and also all the claims and the group handling that you like to provide as part of the SAML token is completely managed by the corporate IDP. If you like to have that, or if you want this that way, most of the time it's not what customers want. The customers want to have the identity authentication store to take care of the authorization and group assignments. But we will come to this later on. So now let's take a look at the flow. So the user tries to access the application. Application will delegate authentication to the IAS. And now the IAS will also delegate the authentication to the corporate IDP. Now the user has to enter his credentials, or maybe is using multi-factor, single sign-on, whatever, and will be provided with a SAML token from Azure. This SAML token will be forwarded to the identity authentication service, and now it depends on the configuration. So it means that you can optionally manage your users and groups here, but you must not in the first step. In this case, we don't manage any local users, so the identity authentication service still is just forwarding the token as it is, and we can use that token in our target application. That is the one that we now take a look on. First of all, to do this, we first will create the user that we just created manually. So let me just remove that Cloud Madness user from the user store. So it's really sure that there is no local user available now. Also, we have to set in the application, in the demo application that we just used, we have to set the risk-based authentication rule to allow. That's just in order to be able to use the demonstration here. Okay, so that's it. And also, we like to use the federation now. That means if you take a look at the IAM showcase application, and we scroll down in the trust settings, you can see there's something that's called conditional authentication. This is something you do on an application basis. So each application you can configure individually. That means here you can configure if your default identity provider is identity authentication or a connected identity provider. This time I have connected my Azure Active Directory tenant to this IaaS, or I can easily select that I want to keep the default one, but I want to add a rule based on a specific email domain. That's what I have configured. So all users from this email domain will be forwarded to the Azure Active Directory. Other users will need to have a local user on the IaaS. Of course, for that, before we have configured a corporate identity provider. That's more or less a simple metadata exchange. Some configurations, it's done in under 5 minutes, and then you are linked to your Azure Active Directory. Okay, so let's go over to the end user point of view. Again, let's open the browser and let's try to log into our demo application. This time, I'm using a user that's called Cloud Madness at my domain, and this one will trigger the redirect to the Azure tenant. As you can now see, I no longer authenticate the user at the IaaS, but I use it against the Azure tenant. Now let's sign in. And now I'm coming back from Azure and it says hello cloud. So obviously I'm another user now. You can see the email address of that user, and you can see the additional information part of the token. That is now, for example, a lot of groups. You can see these groups are really coming from the Active Directory, ultimately synchronized through AD Connect in the Azure world. And now I have all these kind of groups part of the token. And still there is no local user. So I have no local user existing here, but it's that the identity authentication is just a proxy. It's just forwarding everything as is to the application. And yeah, as I said, we can, of course, change that because we want to have more influence about the groups and the claims that we will send over. So when we will be independently from the AD or the Azure team. And for that, we will first of all need to have a user account in the identity authentication in order to mirror our Azure user. This user will have no credentials. That's important to understand. So you don't need to set a password for that user. It's just required in order to be mapped. I will use a tool called Postman for that, just to demonstrate the automated user creation process. It's more or less just that you see something, because when we use a IDM or the identity provisioning service, That's more or less just one click and something is happening in the background. And here I've just provided some role collection, or let's say either it's a collection of postman tasks, and there we can, for example, easily connect to the SCIM endpoint, and we can, for example, search for users. We can send this over, and then we get directly the result from our identity authentication tenant. So here we can easily, for example, select our test user. That means we connect to that SCIM endpoint. We have a specific administrator defined, and we send over a JSON format body. That means some information about that user. If we select send, then you can see this user account has been created, and we directly receive the response from IAS. So we created here the user Tony Stark, and in addition to that, we also create the Cloud Madness user now. That's it. And this is something that your identity management will take care of. It's just here to show you for the demonstration purpose. Let's quit this postman and let's just refresh our user administration. And now we should see that we have two additional users. One is our Ironman user and the other is our Cloud Madness user. This time this user has some more information and additional attributes, but more or less the email address, this is the one that it is important because that's exactly the email address of our Azure user. And again, this user has a P user and a user unique ID that is really important for all the SAP Cloud applications. So now let's go over and check what happens now. Before we change our setting in the corporate IDP, and now we want to enable the so-called identity federation scenario. That is what we do now. So identity federation, we select use the identity authentication user store. And that means from now on, when we switch this on, we really use the users in the identity service, and we are having full control over the claims and the attributes that we send over to our application. And in addition, we can also allow access only for users that have a profile, that have a user in the identity authentication. And we like also to apply all additional configurations like risk-based, like policies, like disclaimers and all that stuff. That's it. We have enabled that here at this stage. And now let's check what happens when we try to access our application. Again, close the browser, start it again, connect. And now it forwards us to Azure, and I have to authenticate one more time. Now I would expect, exactly. Now I have to accept the disclaimer, and now I should be user 180. That is exactly the user we have just created automatically, and that user has been mapped by our Azure account. So here now we can see that this user is authenticated by Azure, but at the end it's a user object in the IAS, meaning there are no groups available from the identity authentication. So the groups are not just lost, but we have not configured our IAS to forward specific groups from Azure now. So let's decide to enrich the SAML assertion that we now send to the application by enriching claims from Azure. That's very easy to achieve. So we can go over to our application. We select the application that we like to configure now. That's again our showcase, and we select default attributes. And here, more or less, you can create static SAML claims like a company name that you would like to assign, but also you can add additional attributes, like, for example, enriching the group claim or a group's claim with a value. And here, as a value, I have prepared a regex. That regex will more or less forward the claims from the corporate IDP that we have configured with a specified claims name or claim attribute name and only the groups that are starting with CMAD underscore, so the Cloud Madness groups more or less. That's one rule. Let's add another one, still the same attribute name, so we can have multiple rules for the same attribute. And now I like to add some other stuff like adding a prefix, adding a suffix. You will see it shortly how this really behaves from a user point of view. Let's save the settings and let's try to connect to the application again. And let's see what happens now if our SAML assertion is really enriched with additional applications and group memberships. And you can see now there's some, it makes no sense in the real life, but it's just for the demo purpose. Here you can see really the groups forwarded from the corporate IDP, and also there's one group without this prefix and the suffix that I have defined. So you can easily also reference now attributes coming from the assertion of the corporate IDP. And if you like, you can also merge them with groups from the identity authentication. As I said, you still have a group membership or group management here locally, and you can easily assign your users groups that they will also have as part of the assertion. Let's do this. Let's just assign a test group. Maybe we also assign a web IDE group one more time. We save that. So we have added 2 additional groups in the identity authentication. And now let's see if those groups are available in the assertion as well. Go back, scroll down, and here you can see these 2 groups are enriched and together with the claims that we received from Azure Active Directory. That's more or less, you can really filter and control groups and claims that are sent to the different SAP Cloud applications. And you can merge them with local IAS groups to really control the authorization. That's really, let's say, important to understand that you can do both. You must not necessarily only use groups from your identity authentication tenant. All right, so let's just skip this for time reasons a little bit. And more or less, that is the summary of what I just showed to you, the summary and also the recommended recommendation for a user and groups management. So the idea is that you use the identity authentication really as a central integration point, as a central user store. The idea is that you really persist users there. So users are, in the best case, automatically created in your identity authentication. They have no credentials. So users have a P user, a user unique ID that is important. And still the authentication is delegated to your existing corporate IDP. You can use single sign-on, you can use all these security functions provided by, for example, your Azure Active Directory. However, the assertion attributes, the groups, are managed by Identity Authentication Service. You can decide if you like to send over group claims from Azure or not. You can enrich them, but at the end, you really decouple the Active Directory administration from the security administration on the SAP world. So you have an independent team managing the authorizations for your SAP applications. And you can automate the whole stuff with the identity management. You can assign users to groups, you can create groups, everything in the best case based on workflows. Now that's really the whole story behind it. All right, so I know it's hard stuff, but we have to go through this. And now we have demo scenario number 4. And this demo scenario, I like to show another application that is running now on the business technology platform multi-cloud environment, also known as Cloud Foundry. And this is the one which is really important because here we are using the identity access governance admin UI more or less. Let's check this out. We move over to the end user client, and again we connect to our IAG, or at least we try it, and then we should see the login screen from the IAG. This is more or less the sub user, the sub ID service default login. We can easily click here to forward the request to our exciting IaaS tenant. And here I also have a user and a password of the user. Let me just copy that over and log on. Now I've done it just a normal authentication at the IaaS, and as a result, I receive a SAML assertion with some, let's say, minimum permissions for performing an access analysis, whatever. So just some, as these are just some tiles here in the IAG. Let's log out again, sign out, and do the same. Do the same, or use the same application one more time. And this time I like to use my corporate user from Exciting. And based on that, again, the rule will forward the request to our Azure tenant. And here I can authenticate. And since I have some critical authorizations assigned, I also need to provide a second factor. So I have to use the Authenticator app, approve the request, and now I'm authenticated and also authorized. And you can see I have some more tiles that I can use because I have whatever kind of super admin permissions. Here, again, in the tracer, you can see a lot of things happening, like a lot of SAML responses and all that stuff. So if you take a look at the last response, that should be actually the one that we have received. That really shows us, I guess, some kind of groups claims, and you see it here, a lot of IAG roles, no, not roles, groups that we are assigned to via the identity authentication, and that at the end will allow us access to all these different IAG functionality, so the authorization, more or less. And also you may wonder why you can see OAuth here, so OAuth requests and responses, and we will take a look at this also. But before, let's move back to the admin point of view, and also let's connect again to the business technology platform cockpit. And this time we want to not connect to the Neo stack, but let's move over to our sub account that is responsible for the multi-cloud environment running the IAG. All right, that's the one. And here, same applies like for the Neo stack. So we can see in the security tab, we should have a trust configuration, and that trust configuration should show us the enabled identity providers, more or less. So the sub ID service as the default one, and also there are two identity service accounts or identity service tenants. And if we go to this tenant, we can really see that this is our identity authentication tenant, and there we have something that's called role collection mappings. That's more or less exactly the thing that happens, the group mapping and also the federated role assignment. And that works very different compared to Neo. On the Cloud Foundry, you can really group application roles in so-called role collections. And typically these role collections are used to provide authorizations for certain types of users. So let's show some more information about the technical background of these authorization flow. And I like to provide you this in this webinar. That's the reason why it takes some more time. But I think it's really important to understand the technology behind it, that we're not only using SAML here, but also we are using OAuth 2 as a standard here. So here, I do it very shortly. I try to summarize this very shortly. Here you can see more or less that the SAP Cloud Foundry environment, it offers the so-called extended application services advanced model, so the XSA, that enhances the Cloud Foundry model, which is called UAA, by adding additional functionality. And that also involves SAML and OAuth 2 as the two important standards. So technically, OAuth 2 is used for authorization, while SAML is used for authentication and also to provide the claims that are used to build the OAuth token, the so-called JSON Web Token, or in short, JWT. And in Cloud Foundry, you have the application router as a central entry point. It is an SAP-specific component that more or less orchestrates the authentication, and it manages OAuth tokens. So it triggers actually the real authentication process by using the Extended Services User Account and Authentication Service, in short, XSUAA. And that component, again, is connected to a trusted identity provider. Again, here we are using the identity authentication. And more or less, that is a short summary. So now let's take a closer look on the authentication flow, on the authorization and also on authentication sequence that we use here. As we can see, we have some more components now involved instead of just the user, the IDP, and the application. So in this SAP implementation of Cloud Foundry, the OAuth 2 client is more or less represented by the application router. That is a component of Cloud Platform or Business Technology Platform. And the application, in this case, the IAG, is acting as a OAuth 2 resource server. So we have the application router as a point of entry. The user is not signed in, so has no session. Now it will request the authentication from the IDP through a so-called OAuth code flow. This OAuth code flow so redirects the user that he now has to authenticate against a trusted identity provider that is configured with that XSUAA service. So after the user authenticates successfully, the identity provider responds with a SAML bearer assertion. More or less, it's just a SAML assertion, but it's called SAML bearer in this case. And this SAML bearer assertion, again, is presented to the XSUAA service in the next step. That somehow authenticates the user. And also, it determines the authorizations of that user. Of course, that SAML bearer contains the attributes, so the group information, everything that we have assigned in the IAS, like I showed before. And that assertion will be used to obtain the authorization code that will be redirected back to the router via the user agent. So now the application router requests the real JWT, the real access token from the XSUAA. That assigns the access token and also redirected back. So now we have, let's say, the access token in the application router, and now it caches also this token, and it attaches this token to all following requests of that user. And again, the XSUAA service only issues tokens, but it does not authenticate the user. This is still the job of the IDP, and that is why we're talking about here. So finally, once the token receives at the application container, that is actually can be a Node.js or Java application that acts as a resource server. It really receives the header information, and then it really checks the JWT. So it checks the JWT for the correct scopes, token information, user information, and really validates the information. So now the user has the access to the requested application. It's really a madness, right? But to summarize, more or less, the application router always enforces that the current user is signed in, and it also attaches the JSON Web Token that it receives from the XSUAA component. So authorizations, the scopes, can be checked in the runtime container of the application. And finally, both OAuth 2 and SAML is used in that flow, where you can say that OAuth is more or less under the hood, because the communication from the application router to the application and also with the XSUAA, these three components are running all on the business technology platform. And for that reason, from an end user perspective, you see that SAML OAuth response and request, but you just see the code, just the authorization codes that is exchanged, not the real JOT that is really exchanged between the internal components of the cloud platform. Alrighty. So last but not least, just some information about the authorization model when it comes to applications that follow the Cloud Application Programming Model, or in short, CAP. So the concept is that you bundle multiple authorizations, and by this you consider different attributes. But attributes are more or less data authorizations and also user attributes. That is more or less the ones that we use in the SAML assertion. And we have scopes. And scopes you can compare with functional authorizations like operations like view, edit, delete. And together you bundle this in a so-called role template. So a role template describes a role and any attributes that apply to the role. And the definition of such a scope and role template is done normally at the development time. So there's a file called xssecurity.json, and the developer has created all these role templates, deployed the relevant application, and now it is the cloud administrator task to really build roles out of those templates. Now you have roles in the first step. If you go further, you now more or less the business users have to authorize using role collections. So corresponding attributes like company, like plant, department, cost center, and so on. That really happens through aggregating single roles in a role collection. That is typically a static process. You can have many roles part of a role collection. And the ones that we have just seen here in the business technology platform, these are really role collections containing a lot of roles, technically. And again, the authorizations, they can be assigned to users either in a static and manual way that can be done, but the better way, the better approach is really to use a federated role assignment. That really happens during the login using a SAML token and a SAML group mapping. And this is exactly where authentication and authorization really work closely together. So instead of managing local user objects and assigning those users to application-specific roles manually, the concept of the federated role assignment really outsources the job of the user management and the group assignment. So ultimately the authorization to the identity provider and more or less to our identity authentication service. And that's also why it makes sense to really handle the groups and also the users in your identity authentication service tenant, and you consider this as a central store for all your cloud users. Okay, we are nearly done with this webinar, but we have one more scenario left. So we now have seen a manual user creation. We have seen a self-service user registration, more or less. We have seen the social IDP, the integration with the corporate IDP, and we have learned about the federated role assignment. And there's one more thing, and this one more thing is that we can integrate easily with an existing user store. And I like just to show this to you with one slide. Just imagine that you have already a typical customer scenario where your user is authenticating on the Active Directory, and you like to reuse that authentication to access all your cloud applications out there. So the idea is user authenticates, authentication will be delegated, and now the idea is to either use a login credential from Active Directory or to use the existing Kerberos ticket for authentication at the IaaS. So technically, this happens through integration to the business technology platform that in turn uses the cloud connector to really perform the LDAP lookup using the cloud connector. It's an LDAP-S check, and technically once your credentials are successfully verified, your user account will be automatically provided in the identity authentication store using a SCIM protocol. But you don't have to take care about that. It happens everything automatically. Result is that you will receive a SAML token and you will have a single sign-on to your cloud application. So the idea of this scenario, more or less, you don't have to take care for any user provisioning process. It's not federation, so you don't don't need a corporate IDP at all. And you can reuse your existing AD groups for authorization. There's also some limitations, like this scenario only works for the Neo environment. Could be an interesting one because no longer customers can have a Neo environment. So I'm not quite sure about that at the moment. And also it is limited to just one Active Directory domain. So and I will shortly just show this to you as a very last scenario for today. Let's go over to the identity authentication console one more time. And again, as we have created the user before, either manually or automatically, we just completely remove these users again from our store because I want to show you how they are created automatically. So we have no users and we need to really configure our application for the application. This is the one that is the showcase one. And here we can see the authentication and access. And there we just enable the so-called SP-NIGO authentication. That's more or less the Kerberos-based authentication. In order to use that, we have to configure our tenant to connect to that corporate user store. That is more or less the connection to the business technology platform SAP account. You can't see really much here because at the end, technically, the SAP account again is connected to the cloud connector. The cloud connector again connects to the Active Directory. In addition to that, we have a so-called SP-NIGO setup. That means we just trust our domain. We have created a service account in the AD, and we have created a so-called Kerberos key tab. So we trust one Active Directory realm. Could be also a forest. That's it. So we have just enabled that. We go back to the end user point of view. And now, before we do that, let's just purge all our Kerberos tickets from the cache in case we have one. Let's start the browser. And remember, we don't have any user in the identity authentication. Let's try to check to connect to the demo service and let's see what happens. Oh, still I have forgotten to wipe my browser cache. Sorry for that. We need to do this before. And now let's try it again. And let's connect to the demo service. And now you can see that we directly have to accept the disclaimer, select accept. And obviously we are authenticated now with a user. And this user has our email address and has all our corporate groups. These are the groups from the Active Directory. And if we go over to the IaaS console, we now see this user has been dynamically created via Kerberos with some information provided by Active Directory. And that really helps us because we can easily take a look at the profile of this user in the IaaS, and there can see that these corporate groups are really part of the assertion. You can, the same way you can filter the groups from IaaS or Azure, you can filter the same way for these kind of corporate groups in order to control authorization to your applications. That's it, more or less. A short summary. It has become clear that now, identity services is really supposed to serve as a central user repository for all cloud applications. And you can consider it like I said, as a kind of a cloud central user administration that is enriched with secure authentication, with identity federation, single sign-on capabilities, and also a scheme-based identity provisioning. So as a summary, you can say that the existing process for authentication, for single sign-on, for multi-factor authentication that a company has already implemented, they can continue to be used. So many customers are connecting to their corporate IDP as a proxy. So they can then decide if the user or group assignments and the SAML claims are just forwarded as received, or if they are managed through the identity services. And this makes it possible by using the user persistence and the group assignment. And this way, customers can control the authorization independently, allowing for separation of Azure and SAP security administration. And lastly, there are interfaces to automate everything using APIs through an existing identity management solution. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this a little bit longer webinar. Finally, let's conclude this roadmap, this webinar with a roadmap. So here, again, short outlook for the next session. Number 3 on April 13 about the IHE. Number 6 on April 20 for the IHE with the HR-driven lifecycle. And lastly, on April 27, Steffen talks about the identity management 8 and the combination with cloud applications. So we made it. Still, we have some participants here, and I think, we can take a look, Mike, at the questions. Maybe there are some questions available in the meantime.
Yes, there are. So let me pick them up here right now. So the first question is there a need for syncing the user from corporate IDP to SaaS application for assigning the roles in scenario 3? So that goes back to a scenario that I guess you showed before, I'm not exactly sure which one it was.
That is exactly the case. So depending on the cloud application. So when, for example, when you have no user persistence in the cloud application and the cloud application completely relies on the SAML token, you don't need it because you then just need to provide the SAML token and map the groups dynamically based on a group assignment. However, the assignment of the group and also maybe the user creation, if the cloud application needs one, these are things that you normally do manually, but you can also automate this using IDM or even the IPS.
All right. Next question is, if there is any issue in this process, how do you handle troubleshooting? And that was at 12:29, about 15 minutes ago. Well, that was from a Susanne. So you might have to clarify, Susanne, what this process is. Meantime, I'm going to move on to the next one. If you want to shoot another comment to us, then
I can answer that. So first of all, you need to be able to first understand the whole process. That's important that you really set up there. And then, to be honest, troubleshooting SAML is not that difficult. You need to have some good tracing tools, and also your IaaS has some good troubleshooting logs and traces that you can download from the system. So more or less, if you have really an integration with a corporate IDP, it can really make trouble on the IaaS side or on the corporate IDP side. But it's not that hard to really troubleshoot the authentication.
Okay. Next one is, how could we assign the role specific to SaaS application in your third scenario?
Well, again, in your software as a service application, you already have a subset of roles like the ones I showed for the IHE. So actually roles or role collection depends on the platform and the environment. But at the end, I would recommend to use the federated role assignment and to make use of really the SAML assertion group claims and to really pass that and to actually then manage the assignment dynamically using that approach.
Okay. Next one is, although Carsten is creating a user account manually in IIS, you can use Active Directory as a user store instead, correct?
That is correct. However, then you have no user persistence in the IIS. That means you can't control really sending over specific claims and so on. So just forward the token from the AD. It's more or less like you directly connect the application to your Azure AD. But it's not the recommendation of SAP. So SAP always recommends to really persist users and create accounts, create the cloud accounts in the AIS.
Okay. Next one is, so SAP is having this 12-character limit on new IDs in the system. Any way to bypass that or somehow increase that?
Well, that is more or less valid for on-prem, right? So as far as I understand the question correctly, that's the 12 characters limit is for on-prem. And more or less you have the P user ID for a purpose, exactly here for that one. The P user ID has always a fixed length and it's it's below the 12 characters. And also, that's more or less often used for the as a name ID or subject identifier for the SAML user. However, there's some move in SAP's cloud space, and they try to heavily use the user unique identifier that I've shown before, this long value. So I think that question is targeted towards on-premise integration, more or less.
Okay. Next one is, does SAP provide trial account for identity service?
No longer. They do not provide the trial account. But you can, as soon as you have, I think, as soon as you have a global account in the business technology platform, you can enable your IAS tenant. That's part of that.
Okay. Next one is, if you can give some examples of the SAML troubleshooting tools that you're using.
Well, most of the time I use the so-called RC Federation plugin for the Chrome browser. That's more or less everything that I need, but there are other tools available as well. It's more or less to have something on the client side, and on top of that, you should take a look at maybe the Azure or ADFS troubleshooting logs. And again, for the IAS, there's another logging available on the admin UI.
Okay. All right, the next one is the SaaS application required to persist the user ID? How could we set up the user sync from corporate IDP?
Well, it always depends. So some SaaS applications still need to create really a local application user. Some of the times there are also groups that you have to manage your users in there. And as soon as you have such an application, you need to have some kind of automation. So it means you either have an IPS and some jobs that you run, or you like to do it in the real way, like connecting your identity management via the IPS to your cloud application to really manage user account creation, role assignments, group assignments, and all that stuff in an automated way. But this is something that we will answer, I guess, somehow in the next webinars.
Okay. And then last one, I think, how does assigning groups in AAD provide authorization in a target SaaS solution such as Ariba or Concur?
Yeah, that's exactly what we have shown in the third scenario. By just reusing existing group assignments, they are part of the SAML assertion. They will be forwarded to the application, and the application now has a list of all groups. And at the end, it's just a mapping group name in the SAML assertion to the group name in the cloud application, and that's it. However, there's one drawback, or not only one, but there's a drawback. At the end, there's a different responsibility or different team managing the AD and ADFS versus the SAP security, right? And then that's the reason why you should somehow, what's the name? differentiate it or separate the administration domains. Yeah.
Okay, and I think that was all we had for today. So thank you very much, everyone, for sticking with us. Most people stuck with us for almost 2 hours here, so very much appreciated.
Oh,
and yeah, thanks, Carsten, for this great presentation and all the content you provided. Very educational, very valuable. And yeah, well, stay tuned for an email from us with a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck. And hope we'll see you all next Tuesday for part 5.
Hopefully.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.